Well, Marco, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person again and be able to have this conversation.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see you and this important topic.
Yes.
Discussing.
Yeah, so before we dive into the big stuff, I would like could you share a little bit about your journey both as an artist and also as a disciple of Christ? And also along the way, is there any tension in between of these two roles? And how have you learned to navigate through these two roles?
Thank you. I am here in Taiwan for an exhibit and able to show my art in all sorts of settings, from museums to galleries to different countries, from obviously US, but Japan and here in Taiwan, and also China. I just had a show several years ago in Shanghai. So as an artist, I get to showcase my art in places that, may be certainly a different context than a church context, or what would be a space that is more public facing. So that means my faith has realities surrounding it that necessitates for me to think through on how I want to present my work, or certainly in terms of creating a context for them. Because I do consider my art to be sacred work that is given back to God. And it's, so to me, the studio is the most sacred place where I work, but I also create out of worship. I create out of prayer. So all those things are integrated in my mind. So when I exhibit, I consider my art to be a portal into new creation.
Okay.
And I really believe that it is literally a portal in that when Paul says, in Christ you are a new creation, or better translations, in Christ, new creation. And I believe that when we create anything out of foundation of Christ intentionally, and we dedicate our work to God, that it is offering something back to God and also back to us as a portal into new creation. And I see art in general that way. So people may say, well, how can a non-Christian create a portal? Well, the Bible seems to indicate that God's grace works that way. God poured His grace upon all creation, all people. And even if it's not a specific divine call for individuals for salvation, there's a broader calling that grace permeates throughout creation. And especially through the arts, there's a reality behind it that is very mysterious and beyond human understanding. But we are able to participate in this glorious consummation of God's glory on this side of eternity through the arts.
Yes. Well, wonderful, because what I heard is that you talk about common grace.
Yes.
And how this common grace is given to all people, including both believers and non-believers. And as an artist, actually, what you create is not the ultimate new creation, but it's a portal to the ultimate new creation.
That's right.
So we can have a taste, a glimpse of the eternal glory.
Right. And Christian called on this side of eternity to be new creation as well, right? So there's a mirroring going on where imagination, if that is sanctified, to see beyond the portal, let's say, and create into the future, of consummated future, as well as present darkness, right? So it's both, and you're refracting both elements there. And so that's why art fundamentally is part of the essence of how we may live and breathe into Jesus's imagination today, as you and I labor to understand the church's role in society, in missions, in all these things. We are ultimately the artwork of God, being presented in the world as God's already perfected masterpiece, right? That we get to work from that identity back into the world. So non-Christians may not be aware of that salvific knowledge, but Christians have the advantage, actually, of knowing what the future brings into the now. And therefore, we are new creation already, poema, God's masterpiece already. And then our work begins, our hard work begins to bring that manifestation into a world that is broken, that needs healing, that is against God's will. And so Christians' work goes both ways: to create the portal, but to live out as a new creation. And those things are often together, accompanying not just creation of art, but how you steward that art, whether it be art, theater, writing, whatever that may be, music, into the reality of the world through the church, right? So that's the pattern. It seems to me that's very clear in the Bible.
I wonder, because for a lot of people from the outside world, from outside the artist world, we often think that the artist world is quite secular in general. A lot of art school, basically, some people even think that Christian faith limits our imagination. But you mentioned about our faith inspires our divine imagination. How would you respond to comments like having a faith actually limits our imagination, and have no faith can actually free us to have a bigger imagination? How would you respond to comments
Well, so how Jesus talks about the world amplifies what you just said into multiple directions, but one is, why would we expect art school to be any different? Is part of the dominion of darkness. Obviously, it's going to reflect that, right? And there's multiple ways that will begin to, in terms of educating your craft, that would actually limit the possibility, the human potential to create great art. And so all art schools that I've been to struggles with this. So, they're teaching students to be good artists, but how do you do that? Well, is it by self-expression? Is it by cultivating the skill sets that you have been given to as gifts? Or is it something else? And there's no paradigm or this language to teach with conviction that what we make is connected to something that is more enduring, more transcendent than we are. So first, if you're a Christian, art student or professor, going into that setting should not expect anybody to understand it. And our perspective that we have been freed by grace, and our foundation is in Christ, that is unshakable in terms of how our faith views our place, our standing in the universe. And yet we are sent to be ambassadors, right? We are sent as missional agents into this darkness. And you might even say, praise God for that, right? Because we have the opportunity to be a witness in a place where they have no knowledge of God, as Paul says. We should be rejoicing in a way and be prepared for that. Now, the reality is the church has not prepared well our youth, or even so-called Christian education has not prepared well for us to go into those dark arenas and to become, fully able to manifest our faith into that context. So there's a gap there. So even when I hear people talk about the secular cities, secular art schools, secular, and I often ask, so, how do you see your faith then? Like it's a question of the gospel, really. How do you see Jesus in what we begin to frame, how we see the world, right? So it's not just a question about the world, it's the question about the church. Okay, so having said that, and to answer your question, what is critical for a person going into, let's say, secular cities, art school, is to know that Jesus is already there, ahead of you. That, as Paul found in Athens in Acts 17, that there are unknown poets who are singing the songs to praise of God, our God, that they do not know about. And we are there to discover and uncover that, and to tell them, indeed, you're speaking about Jesus. That your work actually makes more sense if I help you to understand what Jesus imagined your work to be. And that's a key principle, because no matter where you are, God owns that territory. If we don't frame things that way, rather than being fearful of, you're going to challenge my faith because you're antagonistic to God and your institution is set up against that, God, of course it is, right? That's how the world is set up. So let's not assume, even going into so-called a Christian school, even going into a Christian industry, you should understand that the world and how it's set up is antagonistic to the reality of God. And then your work, your hard work actually, is to find voices that point to the grace of God, the fruit of the Spirit actually, and learn from what God has already done, what the Spirit has already established in that domain. And I have found in every sphere, that no matter how dark it is, that there are these lights, pockets, a group of people who somehow impossible work of coming to see that who they are and their culture in their darkness relies on this unknown God, principle. And then you find people who are remnants, who are people of faith, who have persevered, but their faith has probably become hidden because of all the pressures and persecutions. But then, we should not only be very careful to discern what is the actual gospel principle working in every tribe, and then try to facilitate, or the word would be curate. There are curators in museums, and what do? They bring in all these artists, right? They have discernment, they select good works. And I always tell curators that, your job is to bring cure rate, right? So bring cure into this very difficult terrain of brokenness and, maybe even darkness. But then you will see beauty, you will see glory, you will see transcendence, you will see love and joy and peace and patience and kindness, fruit of the Spirit, right? So that is already manifested in some ways, way ahead of any of us going into that realm. So Jesus is already there.
I love your theology behind. It's very Christocentric. And it also echoes the whole redemptive story narrative from creation, everything is created,
Yes, right.
to the fallenness of this world. So we do not enter into any spheres with too naive, thinking that
right.
everything should be reflecting the gospel the way it should be.
Right.
And yet, because of Christ's redemption, that we can always see signs of God's redemptive work in each spheres. And then because with this hope in new creation, this beholding of new creation, that our Christian witness is a portal for people to see beyond the current darkness and to see the new creation. And then you talk about how Christ is already at work. I think it also echoes to the whole missiological discussion on Missio Dei, where that the mission is actually God's mission first.
Yes.
It's not the mission of the church first.
Right.
And the mission of the church is to identify what God has done in different places. And like a curator, we kind of use our own creative way, imagination, to invite others to see God's new work, redemptive work, and new creation in all spheres.
Yes.
So coming back to the new Christian witness, over the past 50 years, I think the Protestant tradition in general have often emphasized on truth, like truth claims, biblical inerrancies, more than goodness and beauty. So it also impacts how we witness the gospel. Why do you think that is the case? And why do you believe art is such an essential part of Christian witness today?
So there are multiple factors working all at once. So one is certainly this Enlightenment idea of rationalism that took over. Basically, the Romantics were pushing back against that, and you read all the poets from 19th century on that is crying out against this reality of dehumanization because of over-rationalized way that we have emphasized, but that essentially led to modernism, and we have all the scientific and technological advancements because of our capacity to harness the rational. And so we can live as if the right brain doesn't exist, in some ways. But as many have began to notice, that we cannot function this way certainly as communities, as human beings. We will begin to lose our humanity very quickly by ignoring the, it used to be left brain versus right brain, and they used to argue you need both, right, which is a balance. But now neuroscientists are saying, actually, it's the right brain that leads into knowledge, right? So you actually don't know anything until it is somatic. So I write in my Art and Faith about, cooking omelets, right? Very simple recipe. You just need eggs and you need to make an omelet. But it's hard to do, right? So, you can watch Jack Papan making omelets on YouTube and try to imitate it, and you get the same pan, and it doesn't come out anything like Jack Papan's omelet. So there's a difference between the recipe and the actual omelet. And even if you create an omelet that looks like Jack Papan's omelet, the real test is tasting it, right? When you taste, and if it's good, then you know that the recipe is good. It's not the other way around. So we have set up a knowledge base, epistemological base, as this recipe only, right? And in theology and in sciences, we argue over the recipe all the time. And is this right? Is this right? And is this wrong?
It doesn't taste good.
right. But right, the real test should be: does it taste good? Ultimately, have you made anything based on that? And so, really, the framework of knowledge should be flipped. And people have noted that there is no knowledge until you make, you know, and really it's the so-called the right side of the brain leading the left side rather than the other way around, because really it's impossible. Let's say you have certain formula that you believe in, you analyzed it, you have perfected this on your left side of the brain. And we do this in churches all the time, right? We sit in pews and there's this preaching about the information of the gospel that is being given to you. And if it's a good preacher, then that preacher will make it come alive, make it somatic, make it more real. But, you know, it could be the same information given as a recipe to you, right? That you have to, you know, create yourself. And that becomes very frustrating because you sit there and you receive this information, but you're not given any way to opportunity to create something out of it. So you leave church with a recipe basically, and you know you're kind of at loss how to turn this into everyday omelets, you know, and then at the end of the day, you know, you end up with a whole bunch of recipes that you have no idea how to make, you know, and then you go back to church and get more, and so we end up exercising our left brain, loading down information, you know, what is right, the checklist, but our right side is not. We try to force it, so to create action out of it. When it should be the other way.
Yes.
Right? So when we are ministering to the poor, when we're creating beauty, when we are singing in a choir, when we are, you know, making omelets, and then you taste it, and if it's good, then you can say, oh, that was the right recipe. But since we have it backwards, you know, we end up with, many times, discipleship becomes this frustration of not being able to manifest something that is, you know, encoded in as the gospel. Yeah. And this, so to me, one of the blessings of what Jesus preached was that, you know, he was using intentionally metaphors and way of communicating and speaking in parables that forced us to action. Rather than, you know, like the checklist of things, you know, have you done this, have you done this? He said, well, farmer went out to sow. And we're like, what does that mean? Like, I'm not a farmer. But then that forces us to think, okay, to activate our imagination, right? To understand that what Jesus is saying is, no, we're all farmers. We're all sowing. We're all, you know, tilling the ground, and we are all seeing, hopefully, something come out of the ground. But is it weeds? Is it, you know, is it something that is productive? Something that will create the future? Or is it going to be, you know, something that will take away the good fruit, right? So all these questions, you kind of have to imagine into, right, to manifest through hopefully a tangible activity of some kind. And then you begin to understand what the information of who God is, what we are to do with, you know, this information of the good news into the world.
When you talk about discipleship, it also reminds me that when Jesus calls his disciple, he calls his disciple to live with him, to walk with him.
That's right.
So it's not only the death and resurrection of Christ, but it's also the life of Christ that demonstrates to us what a human being is. And I'm also curious that you talk about this changing paradigm of our framework of knowledge. So in the past, we focused on the recipe, but not the omelet. But now we see that it's the omelet that actually draws people.
That's right.
And when you have a good memory or a good experience of the omelet, you want to learn how to make it.
That's right.
How would this inform or inspire the way we do theological education. I'm curious about your thought because you taught at Fuller.
I know. So you visited me in my studio, right?
Yes.
A place of making.
Yes.
So the only way I found effective in teaching is rather than in classrooms talking about this, you actually make things, right? And you make a mess because a lot of times in making, it's a difficult work of manifesting ideas into reality. And we learn very quickly that that's a very difficult thing to do. You may be able to write a PhD thesis, which is also hard, absolutely. But it's a different kind of mode of creating reality, right? Yeah. So I always thought that artists who are making in their studios and working very hard to manifest ideas into reality, that should be acknowledged as at least part of the knowledge base of the university. And, and I do think that people are starting to realize this, that there is so many diverse ways of understanding and encouraging students to grow. But in theological education, I feel like theological education is closer to art than it is to, let's say, pharmaceuticals, because you're trying to create a formula to come up with a solution for certain, disease. You have to have a lot of testing, right? Minute way of testing that to make it work. But I think theological education is, oftentimes it's not that. It's not trying to solve one particular problem. It's really this broader act of creating something new into the world, right? So you can probably learn more from an artist struggling to create a painting, or a musician struggling to compose music, or a chef making omelets, than you are. They're certainly closer to that reality, because the pastors who go out into the world, they're asked to make, right? They're asked to create communities. They're asked to create sermons. They're asked to create, churches, sometimes church planters. They're asked to, but they're not equipped in any way to be artists. They may be equipped to be, like the
CEO.
Right, certainly CEOs, certainly maybe pharmaceutical, researcher.
Yeah.
And so I always wondered, so first of all, why that is so. What are the underlying assumptions that led to this form of education? And it's true of all education. A lot of specifically education that leads into an outcome, right? You're training a student to master certain ways of engineering or certain ways of, understanding the market, and it's actually not very useful once you get into the world, because that skill is very limited, right? It's very narrow. So once, technology goes beyond that, it's no longer, useful to that person. So I always feel like theological education should be very much, at the heart of inquiry that asks deeper epistemological questions, that understand how we frame things, and also to learn epistemological humility.
Yes.
Right? Rather than saying, I am certain about this, you're wrong.
Yes.
Right? But the pastor's positioning, or any Christian's positioning in the world, is to say, no, I don't know.
Yeah.
I may know certain things. I have gotten to know this area, perhaps, of expertise. But when it comes down to the complexity and, this fantastic complex reality, the mystery of the world, I really don't have an answer. But that framing, that way of moving into a question, listening and drawing upon others, certainly, but the courage to go on an adventure, to say that even though I don't know, God is leading me to explore this together with others. And we're just going to keep asking good questions, So that probably should be the number one thing in theological training is how do we humble ourselves to ask good questions? Rather than like memorizing whatever it is that we do in classrooms.
Oh, wonderful. You remind me of, actually there are 3 ministry principles that I hold dear to. Number 1 is always remember that God is in charge. And that is the gospel. And second is always admitting that I don't know. And third is that I need one another. I need each other. And I also love how you talk about humility and this adventureness of admitting I don't know, but God is in charge. Therefore, we journey together. And also, I think you talk about this humility, challenging a lot of the Christians that where we thought that we own the truth. But actually, it's the reverse. We are owned by the truth. Our understanding of the truth is not truth itself. It's an expression of our limited understanding. And so it should bring us into humility the more we know about God's truth.
One of the great characteristics, I had a fellows program. I had about a dozen fellows who come into the studio, work with me, and we spend time together. And one of the challenges that I will have for them, for the seminary, which is a very serious place, students are serious. So I say, you have to make somebody laugh. You have to bring in a sense of playfulness into everything you do, right? And that's really hard to do in a seminary. Because people are, like what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this joke on me? And they can say, well, that's what my mentor told me to do. But I feel like, I think a lot of it, Jesus was playful. The way he spoke was both serious and generative and playful. So I wonder how we recover that in how we see the church, right? And we often see it as this, reality of, carrying out the tradition or taking seriously our vows, which is obviously important. But Jesus himself had a way of flipping it, right? To say, I want you to, play with me. I want you to play hide and seek, And parables are essentially that, right? It opens up all sorts of possibilities of interpretation that is often not aligned with each other. It looks more like, if you were to see the manifestation of, let's say, a parable like parable of the prodigal, prodigal God, as Tim Keller used to say, that is like wide open, right? There's not just one way of understanding it, but are you the elder brother? Are you the younger brother? Are you the father? Are you the fattened calf? Like all these things kind of play into the reality of imagined world that Jesus is setting up. It's a stage. It's theater. It's thinking about. It's comedy. It's all these things that we don't think of the church to be. And I do think that if we are training pastors for the future generation, they need to be a master curator of experiences. And they need to help younger generation see that, so we're supposed to live out the stuff, in ways that are winsome, that are fruitful, that are generative, that has all these possibilities rather than, I'm going to be this, very narrow in conceiving what my faith can become.
So talking about play, you have written several influential books, at least to me, Silence and Beauty, Cultural Care, Art plus Faith, and I heard you have a new one coming up. Maybe this question is a little bit ambitious, but could you briefly share the motivation behind all these works and their central themes, especially your new books?
Yeah, thank you for. Let me start with these. And my first book was a book called Refractions. And these were a series of essays that I wrote in my journey of advocating for arts in the United States. And this is not just for the church, but just in general. So I remember sitting in a plane one time writing an essay about modern dance, which I know very little about at the time, but it was because of my role advocating for arts, I got to travel and be part of encouraging leaders in communities to preserve and to promote the arts. And so I was writing about what I would say to encourage them, and just something hit me all of a sudden. Internally, I wasn't going to write this to modern dancers, but I was just hit me that what I'm writing about, the essence of the questions that I'm raising and why the arts are important, is not just about the arts. It's about the gospel. It's about what I believe that Jesus came to do and instituted this way of being, way of life that led to so many of the arts. I mean, the way the arts and sciences grew in, Western mindset was through Christian worldview, giving us an anchor, this specific point of incarnation that allowed both our understanding of history to change, our framework for philosophy changed, our framework of how we view everything changed. And the arts flow out of that. So if I'm advocating for modern dancers, that is something that Jesus instituted. They don't have to know that, but I need to know that. So I began to write essays about what is the framework for how we think about every sphere of the arts. And so this just was released after 15 years. And then I wrote Silence and Beauty, which is a meditation on Shusaku Endo's novels, Silence, and Martin Scorsese's film that faithfully adaptation of that novel, which is a remarkable novel of 17th century, 16th century persecution of Christians in Japan. And Endo was writing post-war and, coming to realize that Japanese culture had gone through so many traumas and including persecution that has suppressed and oppressed Christians to go underground. And that reality of the DNA, memory of persecution remains in Japanese culture. And of course it's about Catholic missionaries, so it's about missions, fading at best. And yet Endo wrote it in a way, I believe, to give us clues of how we might be able to help the Japanese embrace what I call the hidden gospel already embedded in their culture. So it's like carrying out, let's say, this cultural exegesis a step further into missional territory and understanding that Jesus went ahead of us in Japanese culture, where many people think that it's a graveyard of missionaries that all fail to, spread the gospel. And my thesis here is that no, instead, God is hiding the true gospel in Japanese soil that will be released when in God's time. And Endo captured that. I think he had an intuitive understanding that this is, his love of Japanese culture, Japanese language, history, would lead him to believe that there's something deeply special about Japanese culture. And so I wrote this book in English, and I translated my own work into Japanese, But this is out of a secular press. This is out of a press that is not Christian. And so when I translated it with the help of a translator, but I rewrote a lot of it because knowing that the readers would be non-Christians.
Yeah.
So I began to write speaking directly to non-Christian Japanese audience. So this is even more amplified in that sense. And then all of this became a part of my journey of what I call theology of making, which is, and I forgot the culture care, which is before this. These two books kind of go together because this is expansion refractions of about how do we understand culture. This is written to Christians, so this is for the church to understand. You know, we all have stories of somebody in the church, typical artist or teenager, who just doesn't fit, right? They're sitting in the back wearing black, and they're the first to leave worship service if they come at all. And yet you talk to that person, there's this heart that is drawn to Christ, a heart that is actually has intensity and purity that you may not see typically. And so I wrote this book knowing that there are many people who may be parents of this creative child or somebody in the congregation who want, you know, if you're a pastor, you want to understand that person better. And so this book was written to them, but underneath it is this theological principle, what I began to call theology of making, which I don't talk about in this book because it's more practical. It's designed to, and I didn't realize how prophetic this term culture care would become in a world in which culture is culture wars. It's about creating polarities, divisiveness in culture. It's about, you know, ostracizing the marginalized, which are oftentimes artist types, you know, and if we keep going, intentionally demonizing the other side, we will completely lose our humanity. It will become this circus. Which is what we have in the U.S. And so I am revamping this, adding additional chapters to this right now, and that new one will be coming out next year. And Art and Faith is a theological undergirding principle for culture care. It is a book that to me is a life work of seeing the gospel as a promise of abundance and not a fear-based, tactical response to scarcity model. It's not, you know, God created the world in abundance, not in this transactional Darwinian, you know, competition. And of course, we live in a fallen world. So there are principles that work, you know, in the fallen world that may fit the model of scarcity and zero-sum game, but that's not who we are built to be. And so theology of making takes that into what is a way for us to understand that principle of abundance and God's unique presence in what theologians will call aseity of God, right? The God doesn't need us to do anything. That God is self-sufficient, all-powerful. And yet this invitation to us through God's grace, through Jesus Christ, through the Spirit, to be able to usher in the new kingdom, the new creation. And somehow God waits until we make to show up. So that is a lot of what I have in theology of making is a radical shift, I suppose, in how we may view the gospel, because I call it new creation theology. You don't change anything about what you said, creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. But you enter through new creation, and then you understand the cross in a framework or larger narrative of the Bible. And then you see through Christ's wounds, post-resurrection wounds, into all these realities of a salvific work of Christ, to Israel's journey from Genesis on, and that reframes how we view culture at large, and so we are able to see ourselves in the story of abundance, story that creates Genesis moments every time, that opens up rather than closes up. Certainly in a way of understanding culture at large, and so hopefully this will help us. So it's very orthodox but radical at the same time.
I love it.
Yeah. And then finally, Art Is, which is my new book coming out. This is a book that has over 70 images in it, and it's really a book of how artists see the world. But I have kind of built into this the theological reality that I talk about in Art and Faith. I'm assuming that people who read this can be people outside the church. So I want this to be a portal into how even a non-believer can see new creation. A language for us to talk about to the wider world about God's grace, God's how God created us to be, have this imagination and sensory perception that goes way beyond what our minds can comprehend. And why is that important for us to regain that humanity that captures the world in such multifaceted ways, in this wider zoom, as it were, rather than a specific, micro lens, and how that push and pull can help us create a new world.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like from your first book, Reflections, it talks about framing, and then Silence and Beauty, you dig into the cultural soil.
Yes.
And even though you didn't directly talk about the word mission, but actually you're talking about contextual missions. And then the cultural care and art and faith, I feel like it's coming into a theological reflection to theological construction.
Yes.
And you have a new framework of looking at everything through new creation. It's not to say that the creation, fall, and redemption is no longer important, but we are entering into this phase of going into the new creation, and that's how we should look back and try to understand everything. And your last book is talk about writing not only for Christians, but also for non-Christians as a portal, like you mentioned earlier, to God's new creation. So I feel like it's very grounded, and it's also very consistent to what you shared throughout the way.
That's wonderful.
And so my next question is, I just came back from Paris. And I've been to different art galleries, museums. Some art, I just felt I was fascinated. I stand there looking at it. But some arts that when I stand there, I don't get it. I don't immediately sense their beauty. So my question is, so what is beauty? Is it merely a subjective experience shaped by personal taste? Or do you believe that there's an objective dimension to beauty that we can point to, or beauty is anchored on?
I think it's both and. First of all, I think when we go to understand anything, we have to have, again, this humility. And a friend of mine says, if you want to understand anything, you have to be willing to stand under it. if you stand over it, you will do overstanding, not understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's an important principle because I think contemporary art or any genre is a language. So just as we need to spend time learning French,
Yes.
if you want to understand contemporary art, it's good to learn that language. It's a fascinating language to me. It creates all sorts of conundrums for ordinary, framework of understanding the world. And so that's why it's fascinating to me that it challenges how we view the world and what we expect of the world. But at the same time, we need to develop this discernment, right? Because there is an objective reality behind what is beautiful and good and true. And, discernment may come in a way of us fully understanding what the art is trying to execute. So there's the content and the form. And this content side is, so if you believe in incarnation, right? So
Yes, I do.
God, right, sent Jesus as the form, right? So there's a perfect match between content and form.
Yes.
And that means that it will necessitate all realities, all artists from that moment, actually in the past as well. It has reverberations in the past. But it also demands for us today, because of the particularity of incarnation, we have to start to discern, is the form and content being merged, or at least trying to create integration. And if that's the case, then all artists, it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not, have to operate to bring in integration of some kind in their work. And if they're doing that, then it's worthy of study for us as Christians.
Yeah.
Because we can learn whatever the artist is doing, whether the artist is far from God and operating clearly in the domain of darkness. But that artist, because is doing the hard work of integrating something, right? Bringing something over or together, wrestling with it, that might be very helpful for us to understand how we might bring the gospel integration into culture. That might give us a key.
Wow. Well, wonderful. So it's a both and.
Yes.
Content and format.
Content and form.
And form. And also from the principle of incarnation.
Yes.
And one of the things you mentioned earlier about the book Silence and Beauty, I was quite touched, is because you talk about the Japanese history, the Japanese culture. There's a lot of trauma. And a lot of times when we try to do evangelization in Japan, I think a lot of the failure is because we use a very Western way to do the recipe way, but not the omelet way. So there's a lot of struggle and frustration. And your art uniquely integrates Japanese traditions with Western art categories. How do you see the role of culture in shaping Christian witness? Especially since the gospel has so often been framed through a Western cultural lens. I wonder what's your take on that?
I'll show you another book here, which is this big book. And it's called For Holy Gospels Project, which I was asked to do in 2011. And this is for the 400th anniversary of King James Bible. And apparently, there has not been effort by a Bible publisher commissioning a single artist in 430 years or something like that. That's how far we have gone from this integration of visual images to scripture, right? And so people wondered how I would go about this. And what's interesting, this answers your question actually, because I'm using Japanese materials, right? And the tradition of Japan to create these paintings. These are large paintings done on Japanese paper, stretched over panels, layers over and over. There's 150 layers before you begin to paint. But this work is slow work, and it's very much way that I have been trained in Japan in a context, non-Christian context, right? People wonder you were trained in Egypt, actually became a touch point for me to understand that it is precisely Japanese culture, this highly refined culture, that might capture the resplendence of God's glory into a project like this. So the illuminated manuscript tradition goes, there's a common bridge between the West and East. So illuminations were done with gold and minerals in the same way that this project was done for me, but we're using the same materials, right? So there's this common bridge between West and East. And somehow, when I was painting some of these images, when you depict illuminations in gold, it just has this resonance with the words of Scripture. And it's just a way that I think materials work and open up the passages in a certain way. And so for me, until I did this project, I didn't really fully understand that the reason why God brought me to Japan to learn to be an expert in what's called Nihonga, Japanese art, Japanese style painting, was not just so that I can learn the Japanese way of painting, but it is to find the gospel in Japanese culture. And by learning this method, which actually came very natural to me, I'm trying to find this Luke page, but that there was this very significant hidden reality of what God intended for Japanese culture to become. And so this became a way for me to kind of begin to ask this question, is that because, just because of my personality, or is there a fundamental historical and theological reality that only Japanese culture can uncover and release into the world? Right? So that's kind of the project here that, I don't know if that answers your questions fully.
Yes. If I may, I would love to share also some reflection on my current reflection on the role of Chinese church.
Yes.
A lot of time, I think people are seeking identity of our Chinese church, and oftentimes we use Chineseness to understand church. But I think we should think the other way around. It's through the church we understand our Chineseness.
Yes.
And our Chineseness is a gift from God.
Yes.
To reveal certain part of the gospel to the world. Yet we also need other cultures to reveal, unlock other doors, other lenses to see the gospel.
Mosaic.
So when we see it as a gift, not as our core identity, it frees us from nationalism, frees us from ethnocentrism. And so that as Chinese church, we can truly be a church along with churches from other culture, other language, ethnicity. And so I love the way you talk about this Japaneseness, how it can witness the gospel.
Well, it's the interdependence. Right? The mosaic, that pieces are put together by God as a body of Christ. And there's a sense in which each culture is liberated by discovering the essence of the other. Especially enemy cultures. Right? So that's kind of how I'm beginning to see this is understanding that there is so much to be gained when neighboring nations that often animosity, is there, but at the same time, that is kind of an entry point for the church to begin to harness something that only in God's miracle can we discover about each other.
I love it. And I think this is the gospel of the reconciliation. It's that we're not trying to ignore or pretend the hostility, the hurt from the past. It's not there, but by beholding it. And I remember you in other places you shared about kintsugi. Beholding the brokenness. And I think much of your work reflects on the themes of suffering, brokenness, and hope. And how has your art helped you to process through trauma, both personally and communally? And how might the church learn from the arts in engaging grief and lament?
So again, if you look from the new creation lens, you're speaking about the post-resurrection telos of God, when Jesus says, be perfect, as God in heaven is perfect. And most people assume, well, we have to be perfect, like we have to be unblemished and we have to be polished and we have to be, but that's not the telos of Jesus. Telos of Jesus is this resurrected Christ with wounds, right? Jesus chose to come back as a human being, which is remarkable to me. Like, why would he choose that reality for all that he went through? The suffering, the pain, and what he endured. But he chose that intentionally forever, right? And not only that, he came back as a wounded human being. When you think about that, it's so powerful, because that's the telos. That is the perfection of God, is in the woundedness of Christ. And it is through his wounds we are healed. So the natural, logical question to ask next, after beholding that, is, what about our wounds? What about our trauma? What about, and I think the place that we can ponder about is Paul saying, in my weakness, God is made perfect. And so we have to kind of do a very delicate dance here of not obviously glorifying brokenness, right? And certainly not our sins, but our wounds are meant to be part of this reality of us discovering what it means to live into Christ's wounds. And if we are able to bring our wounds to be part of this reality of post-resurrection reality of Jesus, and Jesus had promised that is the portal through which we are healed, then that means that there's nothing on this side of eternity that will not be part of the redemptive, beautiful wounds of Christ. That through his wounds, we are healed. We are actually, our wounds become part of that glorified reality of Christ creating something new, like kintsugi, where a broken vessel is not fixed, but mended in its brokenness, right? And the gold and urushi become part of this process of sanctification, where our wounds are still there. And yet it is glorified. And it is the resulting vessel is far more valuable than the original, however valuable original may have been. And that this is a mystery and paradox that we can't comprehend fully, but again, Japanese culture, kintsugi, which actually it comes from Korean culture, so it's very interesting, the history of that, how Sennoriki, the tea master, brought in Korean culture to refine Japanese culture in that way. So again, this is interdependence of many cultures coming together, creating a complementary mosaic of colors that actually, sometimes will vibrate, sometimes will reflect, sometimes will merge, mix, but creating something far more valuable than the independent brokenness of each culture.
Yeah, I love you mentioned that the perfection is revealed through our woundedness.
Yes.
And also when you talk about Kintsugi, it also makes me think of that when we look at the artwork of Kintsugi, it helps us to process our own trauma, our own brokenness. And it also, I think, helped me to have an understanding that what Christian witness is really about.
Yes.
It's not about that there's no brokenness in us. It's not about we are strong and perfect.
Yes.
But it's about how God, the master, can make a masterpiece out of such a mess.
Yes, I know.
And through that, people looking at the Christian and the Christian community and find hope.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It is. It's so important. So when people walk into our churches, the first thing, we need to invite is their stories, right? Their brokenness, their wound. And we have to have a safe community to do that. But when they do that, the typical way the church functions, go to this class, go to this therapy. And as if to say, we can wear a mask to be perfect, to be accepted.
Yeah.
Well, it's the other way, right? It's the removing of your masks and revealing the wounds within. And miraculously, Christ Church can say, oh, thank you for revealing yourself, because we need you. We need your experience. We need that reality of brokenness, right? To manifest into this beautiful mosaic. You're the missing piece, as it were. And now we can graft your experience into the whole body. So there's rejoicing, in that honest wrestling. The pain is still there, right? And yet we are able to take in that, person's experience and trauma, and like Kintsugi, create something new out of that.
Wow, wonderful. So you talk about culture war.
Yes.
And I think right now we live in a very complicated situation where on the one hand, there's cultural war. On the other hand, there's a demand for social justice. How do you see like cultural care and beauty and art play a part in responding to current cultural war, social justice?
Social justice. That's an interesting way of framing it, because it's true, right? That both sides have been amplified in recent times, especially in U.S. And there's a way that we long for justice, and cultural war kind of creates this artificial compression and intentional demonization of the other, right? To separate, to polarize. And so there's more injustice, right? People feel like we're not, by winning the cultural wars, we lose. Everybody loses. Like no one wins. Because the whole premise of cultural war is to assume the scarcity mindset and then win by demonizing the other side, right? So when you win by demonizing, you're pouring toxins into the soil of culture that spreads into your own territory, and your territory shrinks. So you don't actually win anything. You keep losing, and you become more desperate. And that gives more, it amplifies this reality of injustice in the world, because ultimately it is the way that we frame what justice is it based on the biblical notion of shalom? Or is it notion based on winning, right? In a reductivist sense. So my wife, who's a justice advocate, and I wrote this book called Beauty and Justice that's coming out next year. And the way we write this book is to really redefine, but to ask what is beauty and what is justice, what is true justice. And both has to do with the framework of the abundance of God through Genesis, throughout scriptures. And then what fruit of the Spirit, out of that abundance, creates, which is a context for both beauty and justice to expand and manifest in the world.
Yes.
So the work of culture care actually is to prepare the soil for both beauty and justice to grow. And it makes possible way to snap out of our cycle of this scarcity mindset war game that we play, constantly fearing what the other side may do to us, when really we are just simply accepting the limited resource argument and putting ourselves intentionally in a place that doesn't allow us to be fully human, in that sense.
Wow, wonderful. I love how you mentioned about cultivating the soil.
Yes.
So it's not about just it's not about winning.
Right.
Especially winning in a brutal way.
Right. Right.
Yeah, but it's about cultivating the soil.
Yeah, it's not a battleground, but it's a soil, tending to the soil, stewarding the land. Gardening is a good metaphor, because if you're in a community garden and you notice this fantastic tomato, it doesn't matter what the person's political views are. You just want to know how and first of all, you should taste it, right, to see if it's really good or not. Not just look good, but does it taste good? And if it tastes good, then you want to learn as much as you can about how did this person prepare the soil, right, to create this beautiful tomato. And that doesn't require a political conversation. It requires probably trust that this person cares about life and abundance and cares about community and so forth. But we can coexist in a situation that is focused on creating abundance, right, and creating beauty, creating justice. Because there's so many overlaps in different religious traditions, different ideological frameworks. We will find ourselves actually not only coexisting, but this will become an abundant place of play at the same time.
I have a working thesis, and I would love to hear your response.
Sure.
So as the General Secretary of COE, which stands for Chinese Coordination Center for Evangelization, in short, just think of it as the Chinese version of the Sound Movement. Recently, we are advocating the idea of holistic mission. But the way we define holistic mission is through three things. The cultural mandate, the Great Commandment, and the Great Commission. So the cultural mandate is to create something good and beautiful and glorious, to reflect who God is. And the Great Commandment is loving God and our neighbors. And the Great Commission is about making disciples of all nations. And all these three things are inseparable. And once we separate it, making disciple evangelism become very a one way, or we just using it as a tool to get people in. So that's how we try to reframe the conversation of what holistic mission is about. And I would love to hear your take on that.
I love that there's a Trinitarian sense to that. And I think there's something that is, and all three, it relates to making, right? So that means you're really framing, it should look more like a studio than a conference room.
Okay.
Than a office building, maybe even a playground or a garden, because you're talking about Genesis, creating soil of abundance, and you're talking about really bringing justice in a fractured world, right? And bringing in ultimately the kind of justice that leads to beauty. So my wife says, as a justice advocate, she's not, as a lawyer and justice advocate, she's not looking just to create justice out of injustice. She's actually trying to create beauty. And that telos of, her work is very much at the heart of, I think, everything you're talking about, but especially when you're dealing with creation mandate or Jesus, commandment to love our neighbors, right? You can't love your neighbor in a context of injustice fully, right? Yeah. So, and then the Great Commission, mandates the missional sending out, that is the Spirit's unction to make disciples, create churches. This is a birthing process. It has to be done in a way that honors the body of Christ. To make it anything mechanical, and certainly, as you know, separated from the other role of the body of Christ is going to be, reducing the potential of what Great Commission can be in the world. So I like that kind of Trinitarian way of. Yeah.
I also like the way you use making, the word making, to tie all these three together. And I have a question. You mentioned that promoting justice or bringing justice by creating beauty. Can you say more on that? Because when we think about advocating for justice, oftentimes in the media, it's about protesting, it's about argument, but how can creating beauty brings justice?
So my wife and I were co-presenting in a gallery in New York where I had my show, and there was an ambassador there who came up to us, and he said, I've been around the world in various roles, and when you spoke about justice and beauty together, it intrigued me because I've seen justice that is
brutal,
cruel.
Cruel.
That is brutal and cruel. And it's all kind of obvious to look at the whole and say, well, those two must go together. But oftentimes the structure is not set up to do that. And part of the difficulty for this ambassador would be to say that, well, we don't really have a cultural language, let's say, to push together in this difficult work to insist that things become beautiful when we see injustice, right? To look for that, to see that there's an intrinsic drive that every human has toward beauty that is not being satisfied because of this fracture that has taken place. So the framework, the language is not there. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the churches took the lead in crafting a language, not just for the church, but for the world, to say, why is freedom? Why is there longing for freedom? Why is there longing for justice? Why is there longing for beauty that community, every community seems to have, right? The intrinsic drive is there. And every person can see it, but we don't have a way to implement it, to talk about it, to do the hard work of creating strategies around it. So that can be one of the ways that your group can take the lead in crafting a language that, again, not just for the churches, but for communities at large, to say, how do we find a way to bring those elements together to prepare the soil for the next generation, that they will flourish because of the hard work that we've done to create certain protocols, certain ways that we can frame the language around it, define the terms, and then possibly begin to implement some of these principles in smaller communities to see if it works, and if it does, try to empower that into a larger context.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marco. As our conversation is coming to an end, I have two more questions.
Yes.
My first question is that what encouragement or guidance would you offer to young Christian artists who feel called to pursue art but struggle to see how their work might fit into the life of the church and the mission of God?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I always advise young artists to seek excellence in their craft, and that may require for them to go into areas that very few Christians operate in. And as I said, go in with the assumption that Jesus has already gone ahead of you and has created a way for you to thrive in the context of that. Now, you need discernment because Jesus, told us to go out in twos, right? He actually warned us that being alone in the context of any framework of the pasture, going out into the wilderness, it's dangerous work. There are wolves, there are elements you can get lost in, and so going in twos is, I think, the least of requirements. How do you do that? We often may find fellowship along the way, but also we can be very intentional when we sign up to be an expert excellence in that craft, to know that you don't want to be isolated, right? You want to be part of a group, sojourners together into that, let's say, mission field.
Yeah.
Your mentor does not have to be a believer. You pray for that, but it doesn't have to be. Oftentimes, if you're a pioneer, you're not going to find Christians in your field. And again, God is grace-filled, and God is going to provide somebody who receives you in your faith and your whole self. You don't have to wear a mask. So that's one way of testing this is, I have been very wide open with my faith. Everybody knows that I'm a Christian. And that's not just to, give myself a place to land, but it's also to help others to understand that there is something distinctive about my following Christ that will force, them to reckon with, right? So it's kind of a warning signal, I guess, to others to say, there is someone who cares about goodness, who cares about beauty, who cares about truth in this room. And that alone can make a difference in a room.
Yeah.
So there are different ways of doing that. You don't want to be obnoxious, and you don't want to I'm a Christian, so I don't do this, I don't do that. Only there are certain things that you can create a boundary around and so forth. But that again requires a wisdom of sojourners going with you, asking questions, right, together, and then having a good way to process that in a context of missions, context of pastoral, fellowship. All those things are important. So it's multifaceted. But seek excellence. I also tell young artists to learn to define your own success. And that is universally true. Whether you're Christian or not, you should do this. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we project a success based on what others have accomplished. So we want to be like that person, or we want to be this, or we want to be that. But that's not necessarily what God has placed in your gift mix. And each person has a unique way, should have a unique way of defining success. So once you learn to do this, and that is being comfortable both in the limitations of your gifts, not just the abilities that you have to impress others, right? It's the limitations of what you can and cannot do well. In a fantastic competitive environment will do that naturally. And that's why you need to seek the best, is you go into these places where you thought, in your small tribe that you were the best at a lot of things, and you go into this, milieu of others like yourself in music schools or art schools or, universities, and you find out very quickly, actually, I wasn't good at this in the same way that this person can do it. And then you begin to focus on what you're really good at.
Okay.
And sometimes it's hard to admit because we have a sense that, that's something that comes easy and natural to me. And you assume that everybody else can do what you do well. But that's when you need a friend to tell you, actually, you're really good at this.
Yeah.
I see that as a gift to you, uniquely to you, that other people don't have.
Yeah.
The earlier that you find that, what I call slice of expression, the better, because you can focus on just simply that and define your own way of, whatever the success metrics are. Say that, my goal, throughout my education is to refine this and to test this and to fail a lot, that growth doesn't happen without taking risks and failing. And again, you need friends that encourages you to keep going because, you can get lost and frustrated and, you feel like you're not making progress. But, if you have somebody in the gym with you, pushing you, you know that, something is happening and then you can do the same for the other. So that's kind of two things that I often tell young artists.
Actually, I heard 5 things.
Okay.
One is, number 1, pursue excellency. Second is a community of friendship.
Yes.
For discernment and also encouragement.
Yeah.
And the third is the spirit of pioneering, playfulness. This adventureness. And fourth is define your own success.
Yes.
Don't try to copy and paste others. And number 5 is focus then. After all these, focus.
Focus,
Thank you so much.
Good.
That's very rich. My last question as a pastor, I would love to ask, what advice would you give to Chinese Christian pastors and how we might more intentionally incorporate art and beauty into our ministry and gospel witness?
So Ephesians 2:8-10, we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for you to do. That word workmanship is the Greek word poema. This group of words, poema, poietes, occurs 3,200 times in Septuagint Bible. It's one of the most significant word groups that define how the gospel is to be understood, right? Well, again, standing under, to be framed. So I translate that Ephesians passage as we are God's artwork. So we are God's masterpieces, created in Christ Jesus. So God sees us as artworks of God. God sees the church as the bride, the art and artists of the great kingdom to come. So when we talk about the arts, there are professional separate categories of the arts, but let's not forget that the church is God's artwork to begin with. And therefore, we need to be asking questions that artists are asking rather than, let's say, what a CEO is asking for profit business. It really is important for us to ask, what is it that we are creating? that is something new into the world, that is something beautiful, that has edifying effect in culture, that works as a yeast to culture, and what is uniquely given to us, right, as group of people, and what is the soil, cultural soil that we have been given. And what I thought about a lot as I helped church planting along the way, first mentored by Tim Keller to think about my art in terms of the context of the gospel in New York City, and then working with people like Jay Kyle to bring the gospel into different regions, because I, as an artist, can exhibit in the places that missionaries may not be able to go to. So what that means is I have this window of opportunity in every exhibit to bring the aroma of Christ into my exhibits and so forth. Well, if you think of the church that way, right, as this uniquely given discipline of any kind of craft that is unique to you, right, and then you are able to bring into the contextualization of the soil of culture, then the first approach as an artist or a poet is to listen, right? Is to listen well to the people who you have been given to love, in your neighbors, your people who are they're already as gifted human beings who care about their culture, and they're already creating something beautiful and good in their culture. Rather than us having a mindset of, we're bringing the gospel to them, we need to come in with this epistemic humility to say that we're going to come serve people to realize their full potential in culture that is already beautiful. There are elements of goodness. There's certainly gaps, but and there's truthfulness in what some of the things that they are doing, and how to encourage that, to understand as a church how to serve that, right? So this made it quite different than a typical mindset of a church planting. It may look like, there's a thing called devised theater. My son, who's an actor, has been involved in this. But devised theater is when the actors on stage, they create the play with the audience, right? So the audience become part of the play. And so you listen, you have a theme, you have a perspective, you have a way of, which is for us the gospel, right? But you are throwing out questions that ask, what do you think a thriving can mean in this community? What are you lacking? What do you need? How can all of us help, right? So devised play would be to ask those questions, and sometimes the audience has the best answers. So they become part of the play, right? They become part of the acting. And the good director will, curate all that, right? To bring in, to make alive the entire theater as a work of art together in this, new mode of creating. So I think it would look more like that, which means that you may not have a church building to do this in. You may not, have even what's called a church, right? Because you're embedding yourself in this constructive and creative, imaginative way to be part of a community first, and then you are asking a question: where do I see fruit, and who's growing the best tomatoes, and then you kind of say, okay, so whoever you are, even if you're not a Christian, we want to learn from you, right? To have that humble approach. And rather than constructing church building and church structure from our perspective, you kind of say, well, what do they need to grow better tomatoes? Is it building a greenhouse? Is it Is it bringing in more soil? How can we serve them to do the task of growing fruit that they are already good at?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, so your church may look like a whole bunch of dump trucks, trucks bringing in, dirt, it may look like a greenhouse that you built, out of, so that in winter time they can continue to grow. Or you may, so the whole paradigm, so again, going back to the content and form, you create the form based on the content. Right, rather than the other way, you're not demanding the people to come to the form, and then matching our content with theirs.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So the content that they have, good tomatoes, right? So then becomes a fundamental, essential question for us to serve, rather than saying, you come to us, we have better tomatoes, when we really don't. We don't even know anything about the soil.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Wonderful. From omelet to tomato.
Yes.
But what I heard is that we actually need to, as a pastor, we need to shift our how we see ourselves.
Yes.
Maybe no longer as CEOs or engineers, but as farmers, gardeners, and even theater directors.
Yes.
And to listen well to where God has planted us.
Yes.
And to invite the people in together.
Right.
And then as a curator.
Right.
And then to co-create with God.
That's right.
And also the people who God surrounded us with.
Yes, amen.
And that's a very different way of, modern way of planting churches.
So the Bible, right, is Jesus came, inaugurated his ministry at Cana, at a wedding. And he keeps talking about a wedding, a cosmic wedding to come, right? He keeps talking about, you're the bridegroom, I'm the bridegroom, you're the bride. And the disciples are like trying to figure this out. But, if you went to a wedding, that all the arts are represented. There's preaching, there's fashion, there is design, there's cuisine, everything, music, dance, right? Yeah. So Cosmic Wedding is going to be a fantastic feast, fantastic, full of theater, exhibits, comedy. All those things will be represented. So what are we doing to prepare for that cosmic wedding, right? It seems that the new creation theology tells us that while God can do all these things just by himself, just fine, right? Somehow, because of redemptive purposes, God invited us, the fallen creatures of God, to be participants, not only participants, but we are the bride, the recipient of God's act of creating abundance into the world. We are the recipients. And not only that, we are the wedding planners.
Wow.
We're the ones that will prepare the table for the king. We are the ones that would anoint the king, as Mary did. And Jesus said, she gets me, she gets this because this was nard to prepare me for my burial. But she also intuited something about the new creation being a wedding.
Yeah.
Right. So this extravagance, gratuity of that, and so, all the churches, Christians are wedding planners. We are supposed to be doing extravagant things to prepare ourselves to be the expert in all spheres, to be able to be ready on that day to serve the king, to prepare for the table for all the guests, to be all the nations to come, to be amazed at what this festivity is going to open up. And, the churches, no matter where you are, whether you're in China or US or, we need to take seriously this call to grow in our arts, right? To grow in planning for a wedding. Right?
Yes.
So we need best designers, we need best chefs, we need best cello players, we need best dancers, we need all of that, right? So it's not just the arts in the corner somewhere, having a ministry. It's about the entire, body of Christ becoming beautiful, becoming excellent, becoming, seeking, creating the new definition of what an excellence is, right? And doing it together in a way that creates this bountifulness, the feast at the table.
Wonderful. And that's why we need one another.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marco, for today. I feel so blessed. And thank you for all the insights you offered in the kingdom. Thank you so much.
Blessings.